The impossible fact. They told me the child had never existed. In the spring of 1883, I stood in the Ohio State Archive with a family Bible open before me. The Blake family Bible, thick with births, deaths, marriages, every heir of Milford County's most powerful dynasty carefully inked into history. Between the entries of two legitimate sons, a page had been torn out. Not ripped in haste, removed with a blade. Clean, surgical. And yet, in a midwife's private ledger, yellowed pages soon to be cited in an academic journal, the same year, the same household, the same night, a third child was recorded in steady handwriting. How can a person exist without existing on paper? And why would one erased birth threaten an empire of banks, lumber mills, judges, and pulpits? If you are drawn to the quiet fractures in history, to the truths that survive only in margins, subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from. Because this story does not begin with a scandal. It begins with a system. It was April 1883 when the request crossed my desk. I had been working for the Ohio State Archive for 7 years, long enough to know that most inquiries concerned land disputes, pension claims, or genealogical vanity. But this one was different. A historian from Philadelphia, precise, restrained in tone, asked whether the state possessed any record of a male child born in Milford County in 1862 to the Blake household. According to county registry, no such birth had occurred. Yet the historian attached a citation from a forthcoming academic paper referencing the private birth notes of a midwife named Mary Ellis. In her ledger, under the date October 17, 1862, she had written, "Male child delivered at Blake residence, healthy lungs, father present, payment in full." No name followed, only a mark in the margin, a small cross, repeated nowhere else in her book. Milford County in 1862 operated on rules so simple they required no enforcement. The Blakes owned the bank. They financed the lumber mill. They held mortgages on half the farms within 20 miles. The presiding judge was a cousin by marriage. The sheriff owed them money from a failed land speculation. Even the pastor of the largest church dined at their table twice a month. Reputation was currency. Bloodline was power. Rumor was a weapon. If a child was born within a proper marriage, he was inked into permanence. If he was not, he dissolved. Henry Blake, the patriarch, had died in 1879, leaving control to his eldest surviving son, Daniel. Daniel was known for restraint. He rarely raised his voice. He believed in order, in clean ledgers, clean deals, and what he once described in a public speech as a clean line of succession. His younger brother Lucas lacked that discipline. Lucas drank. Lucas talked. Lucas remembered things Daniel preferred buried. Among them, their father's long-ago affair with a housemaid named Lily, who had vanished from Milford County shortly after Henry's death. But what troubled Lucas more was not their father's indiscretion. It was Daniel's. In 1862, the same year as the ledger entry, Daniel Blake had been a newly married man. His wife, Eleanor, was recovering from a difficult confinement that produced only a stillborn daughter. Weeks later, a woman from the mill district gave birth to a healthy boy. By winter, the town believed that boy had died within hours of delivery. There was no funeral. There was no grave. There was no record. There was only silence, reinforced by church registry amendments and a payment to the attending clerk, whose handwriting shifts subtly in the October book, as though written with hesitation. Mary Ellis, the midwife, was the one person who altered nothing. She belonged to no powerful family. She held no property beyond a modest cottage near the river. But she was present at nearly every birth in Milford County, whether in manor bedrooms or mill shacks. She wrote everything down. Fathers who insisted on anonymity. Infants born too early. Resemblances whispered in labor. She never threatened exposure. She never sought payment beyond her fee. But sometime in the late 1860s, she began copying certain entries into a second ledger, smaller, wrapped in oilcloth. The Blake birth of October 17th bore the cross in both volumes. 20 years passed. In 1882, Daniel's son, Thomas Blake, now a young attorney educated in Cincinnati, began hearing a rumor. In a neighboring town lived a man in his early 20s with Blake eyes, Blake posture, Blake manner of speech. At the same time, the Philadelphia Journal published its study on private midwifery archives, referencing an unnamed Ohio county where parallel birth records contradict official registries tied to prominent industrial families. Lucas began drinking more openly. At a dinner attended by two minor investors, he remarked, carelessly, or perhaps deliberately, that some heirs are more legitimate than others. The threat was no longer abstract. If Mary Ellis's ledgers surfaced, their father's reputation would fracture. If they were destroyed, Thomas might lose proof that he, and not another, was the rightful heir. Daniel faced a choice with no clean outcome. Retrieve the records quietly and risk confirming their existence. Destroy them and risk eliminating the only evidence that secured his own son's position. In March of 1883, Mary Ellis died of pneumonia, before Daniel could act. What he did not know, what no one in Milford County knew, was that Mary had anticipated this moment for years. Copies of selected pages had been sent to Thomas Blake under sealed instruction to be opened upon her death. The original ledgers had been deposited with legal certification in the Ohio State Archive. On the day I retrieved the Ellis box from intake storage, I understood why the historian's letter had trembled between caution and urgency. Inside were two ledgers. The Blake entry was clear. And in the margin, beneath the cross, a second note added in 1879. Child lives. Placed with Miller family, North Road. Payment arranged by D.B. D.B. Daniel Blake. The cruelest truth emerged slowly. Thomas Blake was legitimate. The erased child was not Henry's. He was Daniel's. The attempt to preserve the dynasty had not protected it. It had documented its fracture. Daniel came to the archive himself 3 weeks later. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. He simply asked whether certain private materials could be misplaced. I told him state archives did not misplace certified deposits. He stood very still when I said that. For a moment, I saw calculation give way to something else. Not remorse, not fear, but recognition. The system he trusted to obey him had boundaries. He left without another word. Officially, the Blake Bank continued operating. The lumber mill expanded westward. Thomas inherited without challenge. But in the archive vault, Mary Ellis's handwriting endured. Precise, unemotional, undeniable. Historians began citing her as a source for what one professor called parallel domestic records. Some families in Milford County quietly revised their genealogies. Some did not. The Blake dynasty survived, but it no longer controlled its own narrative. And I have often wondered, as I lock the vault each evening, How many other neat tears in family Bibles conceal names that still breathe somewhere beyond the margins? If you have your own theory about why Daniel arranged for the child to live, or what became of him, tell me below. And if you want to continue uncovering the fractures hidden inside respectable history, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the archives are never as silent as they seem. The first time I opened Mary Ellis's smaller ledger alone, I did so after hours. The archive reading room had emptied. Gas lamps burned low, casting a steady amber light over oak tables scarred by decades of research. Outside, Columbus lay quiet under late spring rain. I carried the oilcloth-wrapped book into the records office and locked the door behind me, though no rule required it. I told myself I sought accuracy. In truth, I was looking for pattern. Mary's handwriting never trembled. Each entry followed the same structure: date, location, mother's name, father if acknowledged, condition of the infant, fee rendered. No commentary, no moral judgment. But in certain margins, not many, there were marks. A cross, a faint underline, once a small circle. The Blake birth was not the only marked entry. Across 20 years of notes, I found 8 crosses. 8 children born into powerful households whose official county records either listed stillbirth or contained no entry at all. Milford County had operated under an unwritten contract. If a mistake threatened a name, the mistake would be erased. Clerks could be persuaded. Pastors could be convinced. Physicians could be paid. But a midwife, moving from bedroom to bedroom, was harder to regulate. She saw who entered through side doors at night. She heard which surnames were whispered through clenched teeth in labor. She wrote them down. I began comparing her ledger to certified county books. In 4 cases, church registries showed alterations made weeks after the birth date Mary recorded. In 2, burial records existed without grave sites mapped in the cemetery index. In 1, a mother listed as widowed had delivered a child with a father very much alive and very married. The system was not chaotic. It was efficient. Reputation moved faster than fact. And once an absence was printed in ink, it hardened into truth. The Blake case differed in one respect. The child had not died. He had been placed. Placed with Miller family, North Road. Payment arranged by D.B. I traveled to Milford County in June 1883 under the pretext of reviewing land deeds transferred after Henry Blake's death. The courthouse clerk, a thin man with spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose, remembered Daniel Blake's visits in the winter of 1862. He was attentive to details, the clerk told me. Wanted the church registry amended. Said there had been confusion about a birth. Confusion? I asked. A child recorded prematurely. Died before christening. Best not to trouble the books with sorrow. The Miller family still occupied a modest farm along the North Road. The father, Samuel Miller, had died 3 years prior. His widow received me on the porch with guarded politeness. When I inquired whether they had ever taken in a child not their own, her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We raised a boy," she said at last. "Paid for, fair and square. No charity." She did not offer a name. I did not ask directly. But I watched her eyes drift toward the field beyond the barn, where a tall young man was stacking split wood with an efficiency that suggested discipline rather than farm labor alone. He had the Blake shoulders. Not the wealth, not the clothes, but the posture. Upright, measured, aware of being observed. If Daniel Blake had meant to eliminate the problem, he had chosen instead to contain it. A quiet stipend. A family willing to accept money in exchange for silence. A child close enough to monitor, far enough to deny. Why? That question followed me back to Columbus. If the boy lived obscurely, he posed little threat. If he died anonymously, the matter ended. But Daniel had arranged for him to live. I began to consider another possibility. Lucas Blake's hints about Thomas's legitimacy had not been entirely drunken malice. There had been a year, 1861, when Daniel's marriage faltered under the strain of loss and business failures. Rumors had circulated about Eleanor's health, about whether she could produce a surviving heir. If Daniel's only viable son had been born outside marriage and then erased, what would that mean for inheritance? The system Daniel defended so fiercely could just as easily consume him. By preserving the boy, Daniel preserved leverage. A living secret could be managed. A dead one could not be revived if needed. It was a ruthless calculation, one that required no affection, only foresight. When I returned to the archive and informed the Philadelphia historian that the Ellis ledgers were authentic and intact, his reply came swiftly. He requested certified copies of all 8 marked entries. I hesitated. Releasing one truth might fracture a single dynasty. Releasing 8 would expose a pattern. Power in Milford County did not rest solely on money. It rested on the belief that bloodlines were clean, that legitimacy was visible, traceable, unquestioned. Mary Ellis had written a counter-history. If published, it would not burn down banks or mills, but it would crack the myth. And myths, once cracked, rarely mend. I prepared the copies. I sealed them. And as I pressed the archive stamp into wax, I understood that history does not shout when it shifts. It simply begins to exist beyond the control of those who thought they owned it. Tell me when you're ready for part 3. By July of 1883, Milford County had begun to feel the shift, though no one named it aloud. The Philadelphia Journal published its article under a restrained title, Private Midwifery Ledgers as Counter-Archives in Postbellum Ohio. It did not accuse. It did not dramatize. It presented transcriptions, dates, initials, notations of amended church books and unexplained stillbirths. But anyone in Milford who could read between lines recognized the silhouettes. Daniel Blake did not respond publicly. He attended church as usual. He presided over a bank merger that same month with measured composure. The lumber contracts proceeded uninterrupted. Outwardly, nothing fractured. Yet inquiries began arriving at the archive. A school teacher requesting clarification of her grandmother's birth record. A farmer asking whether burial maps from 1864 might contain omissions. A lawyer from Cincinnati seeking confirmation of an altered christening entry tied to a Milford surname he declined to mention in writing. Truth had not detonated. It had seeped. Thomas Blake came to see me in August. He introduced himself without arrogance. His suit was tailored, his manner restrained, his eyes attentive in a way that suggested legal training. "I have received a package," he said. "Copied pages from Mary Ellis's ledger. I assume you authorized it?" "I certified its authenticity," I replied. He held my gaze a moment longer than courtesy required. "You understand what you have done." It was not a threat. It was a statement. "I preserved records entrusted to the state," I said. Thomas exhaled slowly. My father is unwell. Whether that was true or tactical, I could not tell. Does he deny the entry? I asked. Thomas hesitated. He denies nothing. He insists the matter was resolved decades ago. Resolved. A word suited to debts, not lives. And the man on the Miller farm? I asked quietly. Thomas's composure faltered, briefly. You have been thorough. I am employed to be. Silence settled between us, not hostile, but charged. If that man presses a claim, Thomas said at last, the courts will demand proof. My legitimacy will be measured against a ledger written by a midwife with no standing in law. You are suggesting the record lacks authority? I am suggesting, he replied carefully, that authority in Milford County has always resided elsewhere. There it was, the unspoken system distilled. Judges who owed favors, clerks whose mortgages rested at the Blake Bank, pastors whose churches required Blake patronage. Mary Ellis had recorded births, but the Blakes controlled recognition. When Thomas left, he did not request suppression. He did not ask for additional copies. He asked only one question at the door. Did she ever indicate why she marked certain entries? She marked those who were declared absent, I said, but whom she knew to be present. Thomas nodded once. Presence, he murmured. That is sometimes the most dangerous thing. 2 weeks later, word reached the archive that Lucas Blake had filed notice of intent to contest certain property distributions made after Henry Blake's death. The grounds were vague, irregular succession procedures. Milford County buzzed quietly. Lucas was reckless, but not foolish. He would not move without leverage. If Daniel's erased son existed, documented, living, Lucas could fracture the line of inheritance without ever stepping into court himself. A rumor alone could devalue bank confidence. Investors disliked uncertainty more than scandal. Daniel Blake summoned the Miller family to his residence in early September. I did not witness the meeting, but 3 days later, a deed was recorded transferring a parcel of land, modest but debt-free, to Samuel Miller's widow. No explanation, no annotation, only a signature, D. Blake. Containment again. The man in the field did not come forward. He did not press a claim. He did not vanish. He remained, living proof of a choice made 21 years earlier, neither erased nor acknowledged. The historian wrote to me in October requesting permission to publish the Blake transcription in full, initials expanded. I understood the weight of that decision. To name the family outright would not destroy them overnight. The bank vault would not collapse. The mill would not burn. But the moral foundation, the assertion of an unbroken, pure line, would fissure publicly. The law might side with Daniel, but history would not. I granted permission, not because I believed in retribution, but because archives are not built to protect comfort. They are built to prevent disappearance. When the expanded article appeared that winter, Milford County did not erupt. It recalibrated. Some families quietly amended private genealogies. Some refused to discuss the matter at all. The Blake name endured. The bank remained solvent. Thomas inherited as expected. And yet, something intangible had shifted. The Blake dynasty no longer controlled its own origin story. In the archive vault, Mary Ellis's handwriting remained steady, indifferent to consequence. 8 crosses, 8 lives once declared non-existent. And I began to wonder, not how many more had been erased, but how many other counties rested on similar silences, waiting for a ledger, a Bible, or a midwife's careful script to redraw the line between absence and presence. Tell me when you are ready for Part 4. By the winter of 1884, the name Blake no longer moved through Milford County with the same unchallenged certainty. The bank still opened its doors at 8 each morning. The lumber mill still fed planks into the rail yard. The judge still nodded respectfully when Daniel entered the courtroom. But conversation had altered its tone. There was a pause now, slight, almost imperceptible, when the subject of lineage arose. Purity, once assumed, required defense. Lucas pressed his advantage carefully. He never accused Daniel directly. Instead, he allowed the expanded publication to circulate among investors and clergy. He hosted dinners where the Philadelphia Journal lay conspicuously on a side table. He drank less in public. He spoke with clarity. Documentation, he would say mildly, is the backbone of civilization. Without it, we are animals. Daniel did not retaliate. He withdrew. In February, he resigned from 2 minor civic committees he had chaired for years. He delegated more of the bank's daily decisions to Thomas. He stopped attending certain social functions where questions might surface. And he summoned me. The request arrived through an intermediary, polite and restrained. He wished to review the Ellis ledger in person. The archive allowed supervised examination of deposited materials. I prepared the room myself. Daniel Blake entered without entourage. He looked older than when I had last seen him. Not frail, but diminished. A man accustomed to controlling outcomes, forced now to confront record. He did not sit immediately. "Is this how you see me?" he asked, gesturing toward the ledger before him. "A marginal note." "I see entries," I replied, "not judgments." He opened the book to October 17th, 1862. His finger rested on the cross. "You understand," he said quietly, "that the world in which this occurred was not the one you inhabit now." "Explain it to me," I said. For a moment, I believed he would refuse. Instead, he spoke. "My wife had buried 2 infants within 3 years. The town watched her body as if it were public property. Investors watched my household as if it were an extension of the bank's stability. A 3rd failure would have weakened more than marriage. It would have signaled fragility." "And the woman from the mill district?" I asked. "She was not part of that world," he said, and I could not tell whether the statement was defense or confession. "You arranged payment," I said. "You arranged placement." "Yes." "Why not eliminate the risk entirely?" He met my eyes then. "Because elimination leaves no contingency." The word settled heavily between us. Contingency. A living son, though unofficial, preserved leverage. If Eleanor proved barren, if Thomas did not survive childhood illness, if investors required evidence of succession, there would be proof of virility, of continuity. Not love. Strategy. "And when Thomas lived?" I asked. "Then the contingency remained where it was safest, known only to me." "Mary Ellis knew." A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. "Yes, she did." He closed the ledger. "I never intended harm," he said, though the statement felt rehearsed even to him. The boy was provided for. "Provision is not recognition," I replied. He rose to leave, then paused at the door. You believe publication of these records serves justice. I believe concealment serves power, I answered. He did not argue. In March, Lucas formally withdrew his contest of inheritance. No explanation. Within weeks, a new development appeared in the deed registry. A trust established quietly in the name of the Miller Farms young man, not bearing the Blake surname, but funded by a source untraceable beyond a Cincinnati intermediary. The arrangement ensured land, income, and insulation from claim. Containment had shifted into accommodation. Thomas Blake visited once more before summer. My father has structured matters to avoid litigation, he said. There will be no public challenge. And the man on the North Road? I asked. He has chosen not to pursue recognition. Chosen? I repeated. Thomas did not answer directly. There are lives that survive better without names attached to them, he said. Perhaps he believed it. Perhaps he needed to. By autumn, Milford County adjusted fully to its altered equilibrium. The Blake name still carried weight, but no longer myth. It was a family, complex, flawed, documented. Mary Ellis's 8 crosses began appearing in academic footnotes. Students cited them in lectures on local governance and private record-keeping. Other counties sent inquiries about independent midwife archives. The system had not collapsed. It had been illuminated. And illumination does not destroy power overnight. It exposes its mechanics. The man in the field on the North Road married that year. His children would carry the Miller name. They would inherit land free of mortgage. They would not inherit a dynasty, but they would inherit presence. As for Daniel Blake, he died in 1886, not disgraced, not celebrated, simply recorded. His obituary mentioned philanthropy, business acumen, and devotion to family. It did not mention October 17, 1862. It did not need to. Because in the State Archive, under controlled temperature and careful cataloging, the entry remains. A cross in the margin. A reminder that systems built on silence rarely account for those who write anyway. If you are ready, we can continue into the final part, where history decides what it remembers and what it quietly lets live beyond control. Daniel Blake was buried beneath a polished stone that made no reference to uncertainty. The funeral procession moved through Milford County in orderly silence in May of 1886. Bank directors stood in stiff black coats. The pastor spoke of discipline, foresight, stewardship. Thomas received condolences with the composure expected of a rightful heir. Lucas stood slightly apart, sober for once, his expression unreadable. No one mentioned Mary Ellis. No one mentioned October 17, 1862. But absence, I had learned, does not erase presence. It only relocates it. In the months following Daniel's death, Thomas assumed full control of the Blake Bank. He proved efficient, modern in his thinking, cautious where his father had been strategic. He reduced risky lending. He expanded into rail bonds. Publicly, he spoke of transparency and reform, positioning himself as a steward of a new era rather than guardian of an old one. Privately, he came to the archive one final time. He did not request removal of records. He did not argue interpretation. Instead, he asked to see the ledger again. Not the marked entry alone, but the surrounding pages. We sat across from one another as he read. Births in cabins, births in parlors, fathers named without hesitation, fathers omitted with deliberation. "You've said before," he began quietly, "that archives prevent disappearance." "Yes, but they do not compel acknowledgement." "No." He closed the book gently. "My father believed power required control of narrative," he said. "You believe power weakens when narrative fractures." "I believe history is larger than any family," I answered. Thomas nodded once, as if confirming a private conclusion. "The man on the North Road," he said, choosing his words carefully, "has declined every overture to alter his name." "He prefers Miller," I said. "He prefers distance," Thomas corrected. That distinction mattered. Recognition would have entangled him in legal disputes, public scrutiny, and the perpetual comparison to a dynasty that once denied him. Distance offered autonomy, land without lineage, provision without inheritance. Daniel's contingency had become Thomas's quiet settlement. Lucas Blake died 2 years later in Cincinnati, liver ruined by excess. His rumored contest of inheritance dissolved into irrelevance. Whatever leverage he once held faded with him. Milford County did not erupt into reform. Judges remained judges. Pastors remained pastors. Wealth continued consolidating along familiar lines. But beneath the visible structure, something subtle endured. Families began keeping their own parallel records. Midwives in neighboring counties deposited copies of private ledgers with state offices, citing the Ellis precedent. Church registries grew more meticulous, less prone to confusion. Clerks hesitated before altering entries without annotation. The system had not been overthrown. It had been watched. In 1891, I received a letter bearing unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a single page torn from a family Bible, carefully, cleanly, listing the birth of a male child in 1873, followed by the note, "Previously unrecorded." No surname attached, only the sentence, "He exists." I filed it under supplementary materials to the Ellis collection. By then, the young man from the Miller farm had 3 children of his own. They attended the local schoolhouse. They bore no resemblance to Blake portraits hanging in town offices, not because the features were absent, but because no one sought them there. Presence had shifted beyond contest. The Blake Bank continued into the 20th century, absorbed eventually into a larger financial institution whose board no longer included direct descendants. The lumber mill burned in 1902 and was rebuilt with insurance capital from outside the county. The name Blake remained on certain streets, certain plaques, but not on every story. In the archive vault, temperature steady, ink preserved, Mary Ellis's 8 crosses remain visible. Researchers handle the pages with gloves now. They photograph them. They cite them. They debate their implications in lecture halls far from Milford County. Some argue the entries prove systemic corruption. Others argue they reveal only human frailty within otherwise stable institutions. Both are correct. Power rarely appears as a villain. It appears as procedure. A clerk adjusting a registry. A pastor declining a baptismal entry. A patriarch calculating contingency. And somewhere beyond their reach, a midwife writing anyway. I have often returned to that torn page in the Blake family Bible. It was never recovered. Its absence remains between 2 legitimate heirs, a gap too precise to ignore once seen. The question that haunted the historian in 1883 still lingers for me now. How many exist only because someone refused to let them disappear? If you have followed this record from the first inquiry to the final accommodation, consider what remains in your own local histories. What gaps appear neat, deliberate, unquestioned? Tell me your theory about Daniel's true motive. Preservation of dynasty? Fear of exposure? Or something closer to conscience? And if you wish to continue uncovering the systems that shape what is remembered and what is erased, remain with me. Because archives do not sleep. They wait. By 1901, Milford County no longer remembered the year 1862 as anything more than a distant wartime season. The Blake name still appeared on brick facades and bank drafts, but its authority had thinned into custom rather than command. Thomas Blake had aged into a careful patriarch, less commanding than his father, more attentive to public perception. He funded a new library. He donated to the schoolhouse. He spoke often about the importance of record and civic trust. It was an interesting choice of phrase. I had grown older too. My hair thinned, my hands stiffened in winter when turning pages. But the Ellis ledger remained steady in its place, cross marks unchanged, ink neither fading nor deepening. In March of that year, a young journalist from Cleveland requested access to the Milford materials. He was writing about post-bellum myth-making in industrial counties. The phrase struck me as modern and unnecessarily theatrical. Yet when he read the Blake entry, he did not react with outrage. He reacted with calculation. This wasn't simply shame, he said, tapping the cross lightly. It was infrastructure. Yes, I replied. The boy had not been erased out of panic. He had been repositioned. The journalist spent 3 days reviewing deed transfers and trust filings. When he left, he carried no copies, only notes. I never saw his article. Perhaps it was never printed. Perhaps it was edited into something softer. History often is. That summer, I traveled once more to Milford County. Not on official duty, curiosity perhaps, or fatigue with second-hand narratives. The Miller farm had expanded modestly. The original house replaced by a sturdier structure. Children's voices carried across the yard. The tall young man I had first seen stacking wood now bore gray at his temples. He saw me approach and recognized, I think, the category I represented. "From the archive," he said before I spoke. Yes. He did not invite me inside. "You've come to confirm I still exist," he said, not unkindly. "I've come to ask whether you regret not pressing a claim." He considered the question longer than I expected. "A claim to what?" he asked finally. "A name that once denied me? A fortune that required silence to maintain itself? It was yours by blood." "Blood is not record," he replied. "Record is what feeds children." There was no bitterness in his tone, only clarity. "My mother accepted payment," he continued. "My father accepted arrangement. I accepted land. No one lied to me. They simply chose what they valued." "And you?" "I value staying." The answer unsettled me. Daniel Blake had acted to preserve contingency. Thomas had acted to prevent litigation. Lucas had acted to destabilize. But this man, unnamed in any formal ledger beyond Mary Ellis's script, had acted to remain. Presence, without pursuit. When I returned to Columbus, I began organizing the Ellis materials for permanent cataloging under a new classification. Independent Vital Records, Supplemental. It seemed appropriate, not opposition. Supplement. By 1903, other counties had followed Milford's reluctant example. Private birth records were being deposited preemptively, not in defiance, but in precaution. Clerks had grown wary of amendments without annotation. Church books acquired footnotes rather than erasures. Power adapted. It always does. It learned that concealment left paper trails, that deletion invited inquiry, that silence, once documented, becomes visible. Thomas Blake died in 1904. His obituary mentioned civic reform and fiscal prudence. It did not mention the Miller Trust. It did not mention the Philadelphia Journal. It did not mention Mary Ellis. But it did not need to, because the Blake legacy had shifted from myth to mechanism. In the archive vault, the leather binding of Ellis's smaller ledger has begun to crack along the spine. We reinforce it carefully. We do not restore it beyond recognition. Where is part of truth? I sometimes think about the torn page in the Blake Bible. Still missing, still precise in its absence. A physical wound in a book meant to sanctify lineage. That tear accomplished what Daniel intended. But Mary Ellis accomplished something greater. She refused to let absence become fact. In the end, the Blake dynasty survived. The bank endured. The land remained cultivated. Streets still bear the name, but it no longer stands as proof of purity. It stands as evidence of adaptation. And adaptation is not innocence. If you have followed this record through birth, erasure, contingency, and accommodation, consider what systems in your own history were not destroyed, only adjusted. Consider the margins in your family books. Consider the crosses that may exist unseen. And tell me, was Daniel Blake a villain, a pragmatist, or merely a man shaped perfectly by the rules of his world? Because history rarely condemns outright. It documents, and then it waits for someone willing to read. I retired from the Ohio State Archive in the autumn of 1906. On my final day, I walked the length of the vault one last time, fingertips brushing the spines of volumes that had outlived the men who once controlled them. Deeds, baptismal copies, pension claims, quiet contradictions. At the end of the third shelf, in a reinforced case, rested Mary Ellis's ledgers. 8 crosses, 1 Blake, 7 others whose names never commanded banks or pulpits, yet whose existence altered the certainty of those who did. I unlocked the case and opened the smaller volume. The page from October 17, 1862, lay exactly where it always had. Ink steady, margin marked. No dramatic flourish, no accusation. Just fact. Male child delivered at Blake residence. Healthy lungs. Father present. Payment in full. I had read that line more times than I could count. It no longer startled me. What unsettled me, even now, was the economy of it. A life reduced to notation. A system reduced to handwriting. Outside the archive, the world had changed again. Electric lamps replaced gaslight on certain streets. New banks rose under different names. The Miller grandchildren, I was told, had left the North Road for the city, seeking trades beyond farming. The Blake name endured on plaques and scholarship funds. No court ever ruled on the erased son. No public scandal erupted. There was no reckoning, only adjustment. That is the truth I leave behind. Power did not fall in Milford County. It recalibrated. It learned to account for scrutiny. It learned to share narrative just enough to prevent revolt. It learned that total erasure invites inquiry, while partial acknowledgement diffuses it. Daniel Blake was neither monster nor martyr. He was a man who understood the rules of his world and bent them to preserve advantage. Mary Ellis was neither revolutionary nor saint. She was a midwife who wrote what she saw. Between them lies the shape of history. One sought to manage existence. The other refused to let it vanish. The Blake Bible still carries its missing page. The tear remains clean, deliberate, unhealed. Visitors who flip through it sometimes pause at the gap, sensing something wrong without knowing why. In the archive, there is no gap. There is ink. If you have followed this record from the first request in 1883 to this final reckoning, ask yourself what survives in your own institutions because someone quietly recorded what others preferred undone. How many impossible facts wait in ledgers, margins, torn pages? Tell me your final theory. Was the erased child a threat, a contingency, or the only honest line in a dishonest system? And if you would continue examining the machinery beneath respectable history, remain with me. Because somewhere, even now, someone is writing what power hopes to forget.